Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you're enjoying these gentle strolls through the corridors of time, do remember to like the video and subscribe. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together, drifting back slowly and softly to a time long before roads were paved or carts rumbled through villages. Back to the muted stillness of prehistory, to the soft footfalls of early humans who moved as best they could across difficult landscapes, carrying what they must, dragging what they could not lift, adapting and improvising as they went. Our story tonight takes its shape, quite literally, from a simple but profound curve, a circle, the wheel. A device so familiar, so deeply woven into our daily lives, that we rarely pause to consider the moment it was first imagined, first carved, first used with purpose. But the wheel did not arrive in a flash of brilliance, nor in a moment of drama. No single hand can claim it. Rather, it was born quietly, over many generations, through trial and error, observation and patient craft. It emerged not from a desire for speed or spectacle, but from the slow demands of labor and the enduring rhythms of daily survival. It is easy to imagine those early days, before roads, before writing, before kingdoms or coin. Life moved at a pace set by the sun and the seasons. People walked with burdens slung over their backs or dragged upon wooden sledges over the hard-packed earth. They watched, they learned, they tried. Perhaps they saw how a round stone rolled a little further than a flat one, how logs might shift under a weight, easing its passage across a field, how spinning clay on a simple turntable might shape more evenly. From such humble observations came something quietly revolutionary, not just a tool, but a principle. The wheel, round, steady, and faithful, and so tonight we'll trace its slow and thoughtful journey through villages and valleys, from the first sledge to the earliest cart, from pottery huts to ancient roads, across time, across cultures, across the gentle turning of history itself. Make yourself comfortable now, let your breathing soften, and allow your thoughts to drift as we begin our quiet reflection on the invention of the wheel. Long before the wheel found its place in the world, people moved with the strength of their own bodies, and sometimes with the help of patient animals. It was a time shaped by necessity, not invention. Travel was a slow, ponderous affair, dictated by terrain, by weather, and by the very limits of human endurance. The world then was not measured in miles or maps, but in footsteps and the aching weight of burdens carried. Imagine, if you will, a small group of early humans, perhaps a family, perhaps a traveling band, making their way across an uneven landscape. The ground beneath them is packed with centuries of dust, strewn with stones and brush, soft in places and unforgiving in others. Their feet, hardened and calloused, know each rut and ridge. They carry what they must, bundles of food, tools chipped from stone, and skins stitched for warmth, lashed to their backs or cradled in their arms. When they moved heavier loads, firewood, animal carcasses, the occasional rock for building or ritual, they did so with makeshift sledges, simple wooden frames, dragged behind with coarse rope, scraping across the earth, catching on roots, or bogging down in mud. Sometimes they used broad leaves or strips of bark to help things slide more easily. The sledges worked, after a fashion, but they were labour-intensive. Every journey was a negotiation with friction, a battle between gravity and will, and so life was lived close to the land, close to the source. Settlements were modest in size and scope, clustered near water and food. There was little incentive to build far from necessity, for what could not be easily carried could not be moved at all. The animals they watched, deer, oxen, wild boars moved with a kind of grace they could not match. The people observed them closely, not only for the hunt, but for hints about movement, balance, rhythm. Over time, they noticed that some things, under certain conditions, moved more easily. A round stone, nudged downhill, rolled with surprising ease. A log beneath a heavy object might shift its weight, reducing the effort needed. None of this was invention yet, merely observation, quiet, patient learning from the world around them. As seasons passed and generations followed, these small truths were remembered. Children helped with dragging wood and fetching stones, and they too noticed that some shapes slid more gently than others. The knowledge was passed not in books or scrolls, but through gestures, habits, and spoken word. Innovation in those days was not a moment of sudden brilliance, but a slow accumulation of trial, of memory, of shared experience. Even the animals played a part. The domestication of the ox, the donkey, the water buffalo, these creatures bore burdens that humans could not. Straps were tied, frames were fashioned, and the sledge became slightly more efficient, its load borne by muscle other than man's. Still, friction remained a constant companion. Still, each journey required effort beyond measure. And yet, quietly, imperceptibly, things began to change. A smoother path was chosen, a better material found, a new method of lashing the frame. Over time, the dragging became less of a struggle and more of a strategy. It was not the wheel just yet, but it was the world preparing for it. In those long-ago days, there were no plans, no blueprints, no sketches on hide. Only need, and the slow understanding that the earth, while heavy and stubborn, might also yield to those who observed it well. The idea of reducing friction, of easing movement, was not a philosophical notion. It was as immediate and tangible as sore muscles and a setting sun. When we look back at that period, it is tempting to impose the clarity of hindsight, to imagine a clear arc from dragging logs to wheeled carts. But such lines did not exist for those who lived it. Their world was textured with uncertainty, trial, and quiet failure. Sometimes they placed too much weight on a sledge, and it cracked. Sometimes they chose the wrong path and became mired in wet ground. Every step forward was earned through repetition and adjustment. And in this patient process, the seeds of future invention were sown. The mind, always curious, always seeking, noticed the ease of a rolling stone. It noticed how logs, when placed in a row, allowed a sledge to move with less resistance. These were moments of quiet insight, not shouted discoveries, but quiet recognitions. Small shifts in perception that, over generations, would lead to something profound. So the wheel, when it finally arrived, was not born of a singular genius. It was the product of a collective mind, honed over thousands of years. A mind shaped by the simple desire to make life just a little bit easier. And so, before the wheel ever turned, there were feet and hands and dragging ropes. There were children pulling twine and elders pointing out smoother paths. There was patience and pain and the wisdom of watching closely. All of it, every misstep, every aching shoulder, every quiet adaptation was part of the story. The story of how the world prepared, ever so slowly, to roll. When we think of tools, we often picture something fashioned with care, a shaped stone, a carved handle, perhaps a sharpened edge. But the first tools of humankind were not so much crafted as discovered. A stick for probing, a stone for breaking, a shard of bone for digging or scraping. These were things found in the environment, adopted for use and eventually modified over time. Yet among these early implements, one class of object held a curious promise: round stones. Not all stones, of course. Most were jagged, heavy, stubborn in the hand. But now and then, amidst the rubble of riverbeds or the scatter of a hillside, there lay one that was oddly smooth, pleasing to the touch. And when set in motion, it rolled. Not with perfect grace, perhaps, but with enough ease to catch the attention of the thoughtful observer. In those distant days, thought itself was shaped by need. Minds were busy with shelter, warmth, hunger, but within that daily struggle there was still room for wonder, and so a child might chase a rounded stone downhill, watching it tumble ahead like some clever animal. Or an elder kneeling beside a river might notice how a flat pebble skimmed across water while another, more rounded, spun gently when flicked across the sand. The rolling motion, that was something curious. It defied the usual resistance of dragging and lifting. It suggested a different kind of movement, continuous, smooth, even playful. There was no name for it yet, no category in which to place it, but it lingered in the memory, waiting to be recalled when the moment was right. At some point, those same stones began to be used in small but meaningful ways. Perhaps they were placed beneath a heavy load to ease its journey across a short distance. A basket full of food, a bundle of reeds for thatching. Not a great movement, perhaps, just a few handspans forward, but enough to notice the difference, enough to spark a thought. What if we helped the ground become less of an enemy? Over time, people began to experiment. Rolling stones were gathered, kept aside. Not always for practical reasons, sometimes simply because they were pleasing, even beautiful in their simplicity. Smoothness became a valued trait, a sense of motion captured in stillness. It's possible, too, that these early rolling stones played a part in play itself. Children may have pushed them for fun, watched them roll and collide, imagined them as animals or spirits. In such idle moments, the seeds of invention often take root. Play is, after all, a form of low-risk experimentation, and where curiosity thrives, new paths begin. Yet for all their promise, these stones had their limits. They were unpredictable. Their shapes were rarely perfect. They veered off course, got stuck in grooves, or rolled too far and were lost. There was no control, no axle, no frame to guide or support. Still, the idea remained. Rolling reduced effort. That much was clear. Elsewhere, other tools were evolving. The stone hand axe had become more refined. Spears were tipped with flint. Scrapers and awls were shaped with care. Fire, once a fickle gift from lightning, was now summoned with purpose. The world was gradually becoming more malleable, more responsive to human touch. Amid these developments, the humble rolling stone continued to occupy a quiet place. It was not yet a wheel, nor even a prototype, but it represented a concept, the possibility of using shape to assist motion. It bridged the gap between dragging and rolling, between effort and ease. In some regions, the idea began to surface in other forms. Cylindrical rollers, logs, or carved wood were placed under sledges to aid movement. These did not roll freely, but rather acted as shifting supports. One would be placed at the front, the sledge pulled forward until it reached the rear, then moved to the front again. A repetitive process, but one that dramatically reduced friction. This technique was particularly effective for moving large stones, perhaps for building, or for ritual placements. It required coordination, foresight, and the ability to manage weight across a changing surface. In its way, it was a precursor to engineering, the understanding of load, balance, and the transformation of effort. And through it all, the image of the rolling stone persisted, not just as a tool, but as a symbol of continuity, of motion unhindered. It is likely that these early experiences with rolling surfaces laid the groundwork for more deliberate construction. Someone, somewhere, perhaps thought, what if we shaped something round ourselves? Not just found it, but made it. That moment, when the first intentional disc was carved, marked a quiet turning point. Not the grand invention of the wheel just yet, but the first step towards controlled rolling, and with it, a new relationship with movement. But that, of course, is still to come. Before the wheel turned, before logs rolled beneath heavy burdens, there was the sledge. Simple, sturdy, and often little more than a flat piece of wood or a frame lashed together from branches, the sledge was among humanity's earliest attempts to tame the resistance of the earth. It did not glide effortlessly, nor was it elegant. It scraped, it caught, it wore grooves into the soil. But for those who needed to move more than they could carry, it was a quiet revolution. The principle was straightforward. Instead of bearing the entire weight of an object with one's own body, one could distribute it across a platform. Rope or sinew, perhaps made from twisted plant fibers or animal hide, would be tied to the front. The person, often hunched and straining, would drag the load across the ground, feeling the resistance in every step. Friction was the great obstacle. Grasslands were somewhat forgiving, and frozen surfaces in colder regions made the drag easier in winter months. But over dry earth or sandy terrain, every inch required effort. Yet the advantage was clear. With a sledge, one person could move a load that might otherwise require several to carry. It wasn't fast, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it made possible what had once been impossible. In some regions, the sledge evolved into more refined forms. Frames were designed with curved fronts to prevent digging into the soil. Animal skins were stretched across the bottom to reduce drag. In snow-covered lands, the sled, lighter and narrower, became a natural outgrowth of the same idea. And in forested areas, broad flat planks offered some relief from roots and brambles. There is something deeply human about the sledge. It does not rely on clever mechanics or hidden efficiencies. It is blunt, functional, and patient. It reflects the rhythm of a world where movement was measured not in speed, but in determination. People did not travel far, but they travelled well, attentive to their path, responsive to terrain, adaptive in the face of resistance. At times, animals were brought into the equation. Domesticated oxen and donkeys, once tamed, provided new sources of traction. Harnessed carefully, these creatures could pull heavier sledges, freeing human hands for steering, lifting, or simply resting. Still, care had to be taken. Overloading a sledge could cause it to sink or snap. Paths had to be cleared, and slopes managed with ropes and effort. Archaeological remains suggest that early sledges were used in construction, in agriculture, and in the transport of materials, stones, firewood, water vessels. In some cases, grooves in stone pathways show the marks of repeated dragging etched into the earth over generations. The sledge left a quiet trace of its passing, a scar of effort worn into the ground. But perhaps most intriguing is the way in which the sledge pointed towards future invention. It was a transitional tool, a bridge between lifting and rolling. In its limitations, it revealed the need for something better. Every moment spent hauling a load through thick soil was a moment of quiet reflection. Could this be made easier? Was there another way? Some communities began experimenting with improvements. They observed that logs placed beneath a sledge reduced resistance, allowing it to slide more smoothly. The process was laborious. Logs had to be repositioned repeatedly, but it sparked new thought. If rolling reduced friction, could rolling be sustained? Could something be fashioned to roll continuously, not just in pieces? These questions did not arise all at once. They came slowly, across years, across regions. They came as murmurs, as shared ideas, as attempts made in the margins of daily life. Someone might add rounded pegs to a sledge frame. Another might try carving channels into a path. Trial and error ruled the day, and most efforts likely failed. But failure was not final. It was a form of learning. The sledge remained in use long after the wheel appeared. In soft terrain, it often proved more effective than early wheeled carts. It persisted in tundras and forests, in deserts and on steep hillsides. Even today, in some remote or snowy regions, variants of the sledge still serve. Its endurance speaks to a simple truth. Even primitive solutions can be profoundly effective when matched to their environment. The sledge was not a stepping stone merely to be discarded. It was a companion of early civilization, bearing burdens across the ages with quiet resilience. And as people pulled and pushed, as they fought against resistance and adapted their tools, they came to understand, in ways both practical and profound, the nature of movement. They learned to respect weight and balance, to anticipate the shape of terrain, to improvise with materials at hand. The wheel did not spring forth from nothing. It rolled into being along paths already worn by the sledge, shaped by the same hands, driven by the same needs. And so we pause here, at this halfway point between the drag and the roll, and acknowledge the humble sledge and the silent strength it carried. Even before the wheel was shaped by human hands, the idea of roundness had long existed in the natural world. It was not an abstract concept, but a quiet, ever-present truth, found in seeds, in stones, in the slow motion of the heavens above. Nature, in its own gentle way, had already offered the template. People living close to the land would have seen it often. The curve of a gourd, the round belly of a fruit, the smooth surface of a river-washed pebble. Nothing was perfect in form, nothing symmetrical as the circles we draw today. But the essence of roundness was there, and with it the hint of motion. The rounded stones were perhaps the most striking. Found along riverbanks or nestled in glacial valleys, these stones had been shaped over thousands of years, worn down by water and time. Some were no larger than a fist, others heavy enough to require both hands to lift. When nudged, they rolled. Not far and not always predictably, but enough to draw the eye, enough to suggest that their shape was doing something their weight alone could not. It's not hard to imagine an early person sitting beside such a stone, turning it over in their palm, watching it settle. Perhaps they used it for grinding food, or pounding fibers, or even as a weight to hold something in place. But in quiet moments they may have simply watched it roll, just a little, on a slope of dry earth. A small motion, but memorable. Then there were fruits and nuts, round not by accident, but by design. The seeds of plants are often encased in spherical or ovoid forms, nature's own attempt to aid in dispersal. A round seed may roll away from the parent plant, finding fertile soil some distance off. Animals, too, helped in this journey. They kicked, carried, chewed, and dropped these natural wheels, unknowingly spreading life. Insects curled themselves into balls when threatened. Certain beetles, like the dung beetle, rolled their prize across the earth in a near-perfect sphere. Such moments did not go unnoticed. Early humans were close observers of their environment. They learned from what they saw. A creature rolling something round may have seemed odd, even comical, but it also planted a seed of thought. The moon, too, offered a nightly lesson in curves. Its face changed shape across the month, sometimes a crescent, sometimes a full glowing disk. It moved in cycles, its rising and setting predictable, its form unwaveringly round. So too the sun, tracing its arc across the sky. The heavens themselves seemed to favour the circle. Even the act of drawing in the sand or earth with a stick would reveal roundness. A child dragging a branch in a sweeping motion might trace an arc. A potter shaping wet clay upon a simple turntable might discover the evenness that rotation brings. The circular form, though difficult to perfect by hand, was ever present in life's quiet rhythms. The wheel, then, was not conjured from nowhere. It was a human response to natural suggestions, a recognition, slow and subtle, that round things moved differently. They offered a smoothness, a way to navigate resistance. This is not to say that the first wheel was copied directly from a stone or fruit. Rather, the inspiration came from a long acquaintance with curved forms. It was the soft learning of generations, accumulated not through instruction, but through observation, habit, and repetition. The more people watched, the more they began to understand that roundness could be useful, not only beautiful or amusing or familiar, but functional. A round edge did not catch on roots. A curved bottom shifted more smoothly across soil. Over time, this understanding began to shape how objects were made. Even in early shelters, we find evidence of this awareness. Circular huts, arranged around central hearths, appear in archaeological sites from many regions. The shape was not only strong, it was inclusive, protective, easy to construct. Circular paths were walked around fires, around altars, around the growing mounds of settlements. Roundness became more than a shape. It was a way of thinking, a reflection of balance and continuity. And so, as we trace the origins of the wheel, we must pause to acknowledge this quiet teacher, nature itself, the river stone, the full moon, the rolling seed. They were not wheels, but they were the first turning things. They showed what was possible, long before tools allowed for it. The lesson was not quick. It took generations to move from observing a rolling object to building one that could roll with purpose. But each glimpse of natural motion helped shape that journey. And in the silence of those early evenings, as the sun dipped low and the moon rose round above the trees, someone, somewhere, was beginning to understand. Among the earliest human technologies to make deliberate use of rotation was pottery. Long before the wheel carried people or goods across landscapes, it quietly turned beneath the hands of those shaping clay. And in that steady, circular motion, there lay the first real mastery of controlled spinning. Pottery itself is an ancient craft. As communities began to settle, to store grain, to carry water, they found that clay, readily available, malleable, and responsive, could be shaped into useful vessels. At first, these pots were formed by hand, coiled from long rolls of clay and smoothed with damp fingers. The process was slow and intimate, guided more by touch than technique. But over time, potters discovered that turning the clay as they worked allowed for greater symmetry. A slow rotation helped maintain an even shape, especially when forming the rounded bodies of jars and bowls. And so, in small, practical steps, the idea of a turntable began to emerge. The earliest versions were likely very simple, perhaps a flat stone or wooden disc resting atop another, rotated by hand or foot. These are often referred to as slow wheels or tournettes. They didn't spin freely on their own, but could be turned intermittently, allowing the potter to work in a more rhythmic, even fashion. It was not yet the fast-spinning wheel we know today, but it was a beginning. These slow wheels were not transport tools. They moved nothing across land. Yet they represented a critical shift, the deliberate use of controlled circular motion as part of a human task. For the first time, people were not just observing round things roll. They were directing the roll, shaping the rotation, using it to refine and repeat a process. The pottery wheel may seem humble when compared to the chariot or the cart, but its significance is quiet and deep. It shows an early understanding of how motion could serve design. It required a sense of balance, a feel for rhythm, a trust in repetition. It allowed for the creation of more consistent vessels, which in turn made storage and transport more efficient. In Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest evidence of the pottery wheel has been found, these tools likely evolved in response to increasing demand. As settlements grew and the division of labour took hold, specialist craftspeople began to emerge. Potters, dedicated to their art, sought ways to increase efficiency and precision. The slow wheel gave them control over shape, over speed, over the delicate wall of a rising pot. Eventually, the slow wheel gave way to the fast wheel. A breakthrough in its own right, the fast wheel spun freely on a central pivot, driven by a flick of the hand or a kick of the foot. This allowed for continuous motion, which in turn supported a technique known as throwing, where a lump of clay is centered and shaped rapidly as it spins. The control, the symmetry, the speed, all improved. But even the fast wheel, revolutionary as it was for potters, was not yet a transport wheel. It stayed in place. It turned on the spot. It served the hands, but did not yet serve movement. And yet, the principle, the idea that something round, when mounted carefully, could rotate in a controlled and useful manner, had arrived. There is a quiet poetry in this moment of history. The wheel was first used not for conquest or commerce, but for shaping vessels, for crafting the containers of daily life, pots to carry water, to hold grain, to store oil and wine. The wheel helped form the very things that sustained a household. It was not a symbol of speed, but of sustenance, not of power, but of provision. In the stillness of a potter's hut, amid the scent of wet earth and the soft slap of clay, the wheel turned, slowly at first, then steadily, then with purpose. And from that turning, other ideas began to form. What if a wheel could be used not just to shape clay, but to move across land? What if the same balance and rotation could support a cart, a sledge, a platform? What if motion, once mastered in miniature, could be scaled and set free? The pottery wheel did not answer these questions, but it made them possible. It was a quiet threshold, easily overlooked, but in its gentle spinning, it carried the seeds of something far larger. The leap from crafting vessels on a turntable to moving goods upon wheels was not sudden. It did not happen in a single village or within a single lifetime. It was, rather, the slow accumulation of knowledge and insight, the passing of one idea into another, shaped gently by the hands of need. Potters had long understood the value of controlled rotation. With every vessel they shaped, they became more fluent in the language of circular motion. They learned how weight affected balance, how speed influenced control, how a centered object, when spun evenly, could yield smooth and symmetrical forms. These lessons, though deeply practical, were also deeply conceptual. They trained the mind to think in circles, to see stability in movement. Elsewhere, in the broader world of daily toil, people continued to drag and lift and heave. The sledge remained the go-to solution for moving heavy loads. It was serviceable, especially with the help of animals, but it was not efficient. On certain surfaces, particularly dry, packed earth, the effort required was immense. The idea of placing something round beneath a load was not unknown. As discussed earlier, logs were sometimes used as rollers, but these too had limitations. The load did not roll with the rollers. Instead, the rollers had to be replaced repeatedly beneath the object being moved. It was a cumbersome process, one that demanded both coordination and time. And so someone, somewhere, perhaps a potter, perhaps a labourer, began to imagine a better way. What if, instead of rolling objects on top of rollers, the rollers were attached to the object? What if they turned in unison with the frame above them? This thought marked a turning point. It was the quiet birth of the transport wheel. The earliest known wheeled vehicles appear in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. These were not chariots or carriages, but simple carts, wooden platforms with solid wooden wheels, usually pulled by animals. The wheels themselves were heavy, often carved from a single cross-section of tree trunk or assembled from thick planks bound together. They did not spin rapidly. They were clunky, uneven, and prone to wear, but they worked. More importantly, they introduced a new principle: the wheel and axle. The axle allowed the wheel to rotate independently of the cart's platform. It was a technical refinement, one requiring an understanding of load-bearing structure and rotational freedom. In early examples, the axle and wheels often turned together as a fixed unit. Later designs improved upon this, allowing the axle to remain still while the wheels spun freely around it. This shift from dragging to rolling transformed transport. A cart could carry more than a person could, more than an animal could. It allowed heavier burdens to be moved more regularly over greater distances. It opened new possibilities for trade, for building, for farming. The wheel turned slowly, but its effects rippled outward. Yet the early transport wheels were far from perfect. Made of solid wood, they were immensely heavy. They could splinter, crack, or warp in damp conditions. Their edges wore down quickly, especially on rough terrain. But they did not need to be perfect. They only needed to be better than the alternative. Over time, wheel construction improved. People learned to reinforce the edges, to shape more consistent circles, to mount them more securely. The spoked wheel, a much later development, would eventually reduce weight and improve performance. But in these earliest iterations, it was solidity that mattered most. We can imagine the first carts trundling across a dusty plain, pulled by oxen, guided by rope, creaking under their load. Perhaps a potter's goods, fresh from the kiln, perhaps sacks of grain for market, or stones for building, or water vessels for storage. Whatever the burden, the wheel bore it, turning slowly as it had on the potter's wheel, but now serving a new master. The social implications of this shift were quiet, yet profound. Movement became more efficient. Distances shortened. Settlements once isolated could now exchange goods more regularly. Labor was reorganized. Roads began to form, not laid, but worn into the land by the repeated passage of wheels. And in this way, an idea first nurtured by those shaping clay was given a new expression, one that would eventually reshape the very structure of human life. It's worth remembering that none of this happened in haste. The wheel's transition from static rotation to mobile transport was not a revolution. It was an unfolding, a patient, persistent dialogue between problem and possibility. Each cart built upon the lessons of the last. Each wheel was a gesture toward something smoother, something more reliable. The wheel did not arrive in splendor. It arrived with a creak and a wobble, and then another, and another still, until in time it became not just a tool, but a foundation. The earliest known wheels used for transport were simple, solid, and heavy, built not for speed or agility, but for strength and durability. They were made of wood, often hewn from the trunks of trees, chosen as much for their availability as for their resilience. These first wooden wheels were not elegant things. They were thick, broad, and blunt. But they marked the moment when roundness ceased to be a curiosity and became a mechanism. Crafting such a wheel was no small task. A suitable tree had to be found, straight, strong, and wide enough to yield a disc of usable size. Hardwoods were preferred, elm, ash, or oak, dense enough to bear weight without splitting, yet pliable enough to be worked. Using stone tools, the trunk would be trimmed, then slowly and patiently shaped, not into a perfect circle, but something close enough. Edges were smoothed, the surface leveled as best it could be, and a central hole cut to accommodate an axle or peg. The resulting disc might be 50, 60 centimeters in diameter. It would be attached to a simple wooden platform, perhaps a flat bed of timber lashed together with two wheels on either side and a fixed axle beneath. There was no suspension, no turning mechanism. The cart went forward, or it did not go at all. Such vehicles would have been difficult to steer and impossible to manage without animals. Oxen were the most common draft animals, prized for their strength and endurance. Harnessed carefully, they could pull these heavy carts across relatively level ground. Over rough terrain or in hilly regions, carts might be less useful, but even then, their ability to carry burdens beyond human capacity gave them undeniable value. The wheel's form at this point was still rudimentary. Early wooden wheels were often just solid slabs. In some cases, 2 or 3 wooden planks might be joined together and shaped into a round form. These composite wheels were stronger, more stable, and slightly easier to repair, but they were still extraordinarily heavy. A single wheel could weigh more than a man. The axle, too, was primitive. In many early designs, the wheel and axle were fixed together, turning as one unit. This made steering difficult and placed enormous stress on the frame. But it was a start, a first step towards understanding how rotational force could be channeled and sustained. Interestingly, archaeological discoveries have revealed that the earliest wheels were not confined to one culture or place. The idea seems to have emerged independently in several regions. In Mesopotamia, examples of solid wooden wheels have been found dating back over 5,000 years. In Europe, similar designs have been unearthed in Slovenia and Switzerland, preserved in the anaerobic conditions of peat bogs and lake beds. Each of these finds tells a similar story, a quiet, deliberate response to the demands of transport. The form may differ in detail, but the principle remains the same. A round, load-bearing structure, mounted upon a frame, capable of turning in tandem with the movement of a cart. It was not beautiful, but it worked. The limitations of these early wooden wheels were many. They wore down quickly on rough surfaces. They cracked in dry weather and swelled in the damp. Their edges were blunt, offering little grip or precision. And they were so heavy that they limited what the carts could carry, but each difficulty carried a lesson, and each flaw hinted at a future refinement. Over time, craftspeople began to experiment. They shaved the edges to reduce friction. They reinforced the wheel's center to better hold the axle. They began to think of the wheel not as a single slab, but as a structure, a thing with parts, each serving a function. And in this slow shift, the wheel began its quiet transformation from object to machine. Carts became more common. In agricultural communities, they were used to carry produce from field to storehouse. In early towns, they moved building materials, stone, timber, clay. In trade, they allowed goods to be transported further, more regularly. Roads, still primitive paths at best, began to widen beneath their weight. Tracks were worn into the earth, marking routes that would one day become the skeletons of nations. The wheel was no longer an idea or an experiment. It was a presence, creaking along dusty paths, wobbling over roots, rumbling through courtyards. It became part of the landscape, a sound, a shape, a rhythm. And while it remained imperfect, it was also indispensable. The heavy wooden wheel bore the burdens of a world in motion. It connected people to place, labor to harvest, craft to market. It carried water, firewood, food, stone, and clay. It carried, in short, the weight of early civilization. And still, it would evolve. As early carts rumbled into use, a quiet but significant challenge began to make itself known: the problem of the axle. At the heart of every wheeled vehicle lies this central rod, around which the wheels either rotate or rotate with. And how one chooses to fix the axle, whether to the cart body or to the wheels, shapes the function, durability, and maneuverability of the entire structure. In the earliest designs, simplicity ruled. The axle was fixed firmly to the wheels, and the whole unit turned together as one piece. This arrangement was straightforward to build, especially given the rudimentary tools and materials available. A heavy wooden shaft passed through the center of each wheel, often secured with wooden pegs or pins. As the cart moved, both wheels and axle turned in unison. This fixed axle approach was strong. It bore weight well and demanded little in the way of precision carpentry. It was also stable, particularly important on uneven ground, where a freely spinning wheel might wobble or fail, and for short, straight journeys over relatively even terrain, it worked. The cart could be pulled forward or backward without much difficulty, but it came at a cost. Turning was a slow, awkward affair. Because the wheels were locked to the axle, they could not rotate independently. On tight bends, or when navigating through narrow passages, this meant the entire cart had to pivot, requiring space, strength, and often a good deal of patience. Friction, too, was a concern. As the axle turned, it rubbed constantly against the sockets in the cart frame. Without metal bearings or lubricants, this created wear, wood grinding against wood, slowly widening the holes and loosening the fit. Over time, the axle would sag, the wheels would wobble, and the whole structure might need repair. To solve this, some craftsmen began to experiment with a different idea. What if the axle remained still and the wheels spun freely around it? This was a more complex design. It required the wheel to be hollowed precisely at the center, forming a snug fit around the axle. The axle, in turn, had to be shaped carefully, round, straight, and strong, so the wheels would turn smoothly without wobbling. To reduce friction, grease from animal fat or plant oils might be applied. In some cases, leather or cloth was wrapped around the axle to create a buffer. The result was a cart where each wheel could spin at its own pace, independent of the other, a distinct advantage when turning or travelling over mixed terrain. This rotating axle design had other benefits as well. It made movement more efficient. On long journeys, it reduced the strain on both cart and animal. It allowed for greater control, especially when navigating slopes or soft ground. And it opened the door to more refined engineering, the possibility of lightweight frames, improved speed, and more agile handling. But it was not without its own complications. Rotating axles demanded tighter tolerances. A wheel that fit too loosely would rattle or fall off. One that fit too tightly would not turn at all. Maintenance became a regular task. Checking the fit, replacing worn parts, applying grease. In societies where woodworking skills were still developing, these requirements could prove limiting. Even so, the benefits gradually outweighed the burdens. As wheeled transport became more widespread, across Mesopotamia, into the Indus Valley, and across early European settlements, the rotating axle grew in popularity. It did not replace the fixed axle entirely. In fact, both types coexisted for centuries, each suited to different needs. Heavy carts carrying stones or water might retain the fixed axle for its strength. Lighter vehicles, especially those used for speed or distance, embraced the rotating design. Chariots, when they appeared much later, relied on this principle. Their thin, spoked wheels turned rapidly around finely crafted axles, allowing for swift maneuvers on the battlefield. These were elite tools, expensive, specialized, and symbolic of power, but they drew directly from the quiet lessons learned through centuries of practical use. In quieter corners of the ancient world, carts continued to trundle along with their solid wheels and humble axles, creaking under harvests, carrying firewood, or helping a family move from one place to another. The wheel and axle, whether fixed or free, had become a constant companion. Their presence changed how people thought about space. No longer bound by the limits of what could be carried, communities could plan larger fields, build more permanent homes, carry surplus goods to market. Roads formed, not engineered at first, but worn into the land by repeated passage. Settlements began to cluster around crossroads. The wheel had not only enabled transport, it had reshaped the very geography of human life. And at the heart of that change, two simple ideas quietly turning, a wheel and an axle. It is in the broad, sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia that we find some of the earliest and most enduring evidence of the wheeled cart. This region, bounded by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq, was one of the cradles of early civilization. Its cities, like Uruk and Eridu, were among the first to rise from the fertile soil, nurtured by irrigation, organized labor, and the slow, methodical rhythms of agriculture. And as these cities grew, so too did the need to move. Carts, in their simplest form, met this need with quiet efficiency. Made primarily of wood and often fitted with solid wooden wheels, they offered a way to shift the burdens of early urban life. From bundles of reeds and jars of oil to baskets of grain and stacks of bricks for building. The rivers provided transport over longer distances, of course, but once goods reached the shore, carts took over, rumbling down packed dirt tracks, pulled by oxen with gentle determination. The carts of Mesopotamia were not uniform in design. Some had 2 wheels, others 4. The 2-wheeled versions were typically smaller and lighter, drawn by a single animal or even pushed by hand. They could navigate narrow alleys or be taken out into the fields. The 4-wheeled carts, often broader and more robust, were used for heavier loads, their weight distributed more evenly across 2 fixed axles. The wheels themselves were solid and substantial, often made from 3 planks fitted together with dowels, then shaped into a rough circle. They were built more for endurance than elegance. Iron and bronze were not yet commonly used for wheel fittings, so the entire structure was wooden. Axles, wheel rims, hubs, all subject to wear and tear, all requiring regular attention. Grease, often made from animal fat, was applied to reduce friction, and wheels might be wrapped with strips of hide to slow deterioration. These carts moved slowly. Their progress was steady, ponderous, and often accompanied by creaking wood, lowing oxen, and the rhythmic slap of hooves on earth. But they were dependable. They helped construct the cities, feed the workers, and supply the temples that dotted the landscape. They were the quiet engine of a society increasingly complex and interdependent. Within Mesopotamian records, carts appear not just in artifact, but in art and text. Cylinder seals, small carved stones used to make impressions on clay, show figures leading oxen pulling 2-wheeled carts. In cuneiform inscriptions, the word for wheel appears alongside terms for goods and trade. The cart had become embedded in daily life, acknowledged not just as a tool, but as part of the cultural fabric. Religious and ceremonial uses also emerged. In some depictions, carts are used to transport idols or offerings, suggesting a sacred dimension to their function. The turning wheel, already associated with celestial motion in some cultures, may have carried symbolic meaning, though in Mesopotamia, as elsewhere, its primary value remained practical. In this context, the cart was not merely a convenience, it was a necessity. As Mesopotamian cities expanded, their reach extended further into the countryside. Fields were cultivated at increasing distances from the urban core. Transporting the resulting harvest back to granaries, temples, or markets required consistency and effort. Carts allowed surplus to be collected and stored, and surplus meant stability. With stability came specialization. Not everyone needed to grow their own food. Some could become potters, weavers, scribes, builders, or priests. This diversification of roles depended, in part, on the ability to move materials where they were needed, when they were needed. The cart made this possible. It also encouraged planning. Paths were laid out with carts in mind, broad enough for a wheel's passage, firm enough to avoid sinking. Over time, these paths became the arteries of the city, connecting districts, linking urban life to the rural outskirts. And just as a cart could carry a harvest into town, it could return with goods for trade, textiles, pottery, or dried fish from distant settlements. In war too, the cart found its place. Though the war chariot, light, fast and deadly, would not appear until later, simple carts were used to carry supplies, weapons and provisions. In siegecraft, they helped move stones for fortifications or battering equipment. Their role remained humble but essential. Even in death, the cart occasionally made an appearance. In some burials from the royal cemetery at there is evidence of carts and draft animals included in the grave goods. Whether symbolic of status or intended to serve the dead in the afterlife, their inclusion speaks to the cart's value, not merely as a device, but as a companion to the living. As Mesopotamia's influence spread through trade, diplomacy, and conquest, the idea of the cart travelled with it. And though it would evolve in form and function, its essence remained the same, a platform on wheels, turning slowly across time. From its quiet origins in the plains of Mesopotamia, the wheel began a long, uneven journey across continents. It did not sweep outward like a sudden wave. It trickled, moved, paused. It was adopted here, hesitated there, and as it spread, it changed, shaped by local needs, resources, and traditions. The wheel, though simple in form, was not a one-size-fits-all invention. It required roads, materials, and above all, a reason. In the ancient Near East, neighbouring regions such as the Levant and Anatolia were among the first to adopt wheel-based transport. These areas, with their trading ties and shared technologies, took up the wheel for much the same reasons as the Mesopotamians had: agriculture, construction, and the slow, regular transfer of goods. Wheeled carts soon appeared in early farming villages, often drawn by oxen and loaded with grain, wood, or pottery. To the north and west, into what is now Europe, the wheel arrived with the spread of Neolithic farming cultures. The Ljubljana Marshes wheel, discovered in present-day Slovenia, is one of the oldest wooden wheels ever found, dating to around 3200 BCE. It is a beautifully preserved piece, its construction revealing a thoughtful understanding of balance, strength, and fit. A single plank, reinforced with crossbars and pegged together, it was both functional and durable, ideal for the marshy, shifting soils of its homeland. In the vast expanse of the Eurasian steppe, the wheel took on new forms. Here, where communities were often mobile, the cart became more than a tool. It became a home. Large wagons, covered with felt or hide, allowed pastoralists to move with the seasons, following their herds across wide open terrain. These wagons were not delicate instruments. They were built to endure the jolts of rough ground, the sway of uneven loads, and the biting winds of the open land. Further east, the wheel found fertile ground in the Indus Valley civilization. Although archaeological evidence is sparser than in Mesopotamia, small terracotta models of carts suggest that wheeled transport was known and used. These models, often found in burial sites, hint at both practical and symbolic roles, perhaps toys, perhaps ceremonial items, perhaps miniature reflections of real carts used in trade or farming. In China, the wheel appears by the 2nd millennium BCE, likely arriving via the steppes to the northwest. Here, the technology was rapidly absorbed and refined. By the time of the Shang dynasty, wheeled carts and chariots were integral to military organization and elite display. The Chinese wheelwrights began experimenting with lighter designs, spoked wheels, wooden hubs, and later iron fittings. Their understanding of metallurgy and joinery allowed for innovations in structure and strength. Meanwhile, in Africa, the story was more complex. In the Nile Valley, wheeled transport seems to have been slow to take root. Egypt, for much of its early history, made little use of the wheel beyond the potter's wheel. The terrain, sandy, soft, and broken by the Nile's floodplain, did not favour carts. Boats and barges, gliding along the river's calm waters, proved far more efficient for moving goods. When wheels did appear, they came mainly in the form of war chariots, imported perhaps from the Hyksos invaders, and later adopted by the Egyptian elite for military display and ceremony. To the south, in sub-Saharan Africa, the wheel remained largely absent for much longer. The reasons are varied. Terrain, the absence of draft animals, and different economic patterns all played a part. In regions where human or animal portage was more efficient, the wheel offered little advantage. Roads suitable for wheeled traffic were rare, and dense forests or steep highlands made carts impractical. In the Americas, too, the wheel was curiously absent in practical use. Though the concept was understood, seen in small wheeled toys made by the Olmec and other Mesoamerican cultures, it was not applied to transport. This was likely due to the lack of large, domesticated animals and the rugged, mountainous terrain that made wheeled vehicles difficult to employ effectively. Instead, transport was carried out on foot, with goods strapped to the backs of people or llamas in the Andes. And so the wheel spread, not everywhere and not always easily, but persistently. It adapted to local conditions or was abandoned where it served no clear purpose. Its path was neither straight nor swift. It was winding, like the roads it eventually helped form. With each new region, the wheel changed. In the forests of Europe, it was built thick and strong to bear the load of timber. In the deserts of Central Asia, it became part of the nomad's way of life, carrying tents and tools across the steppe. In the cities of the East, it became refined, elegant, even artistic, its spokes and rims carefully shaped, its hubs reinforced with bronze or iron. Trade, too, played a role. As merchants moved from one region to another, they carried more than goods. They carried ideas. A wheelwright in the Indus might learn of a new joining technique from a traveller out of Mesopotamia. A Chinese craftsman might adapt a design seen on a step wagon. Knowledge moved with the people, and the wheel turned not just on its axle, but through history. It is a quiet testament to the persistence of human ingenuity, that an idea born from watching a round stone roll could grow into something so widespread that it could be reimagined again and again in wood and bronze, in desert and forest, in stillness and in motion. And though it did not spread to all places at once, where it found root, it changed everything. In the wooded, rain-softened landscapes of ancient Europe, the wheel made its way slowly, quietly, often hidden beneath the thick canopy of forest and the rhythm of agrarian life. Its journey here was not marked by great cities or empires at first, but by hamlets, hill forts, and scattered farming communities, people who lived close to the earth, whose needs were steady rather than sweeping. And yet, in this modest setting, the wheel would find a sturdy place. The earliest evidence of wheeled transport in Europe comes from archaeological finds such as the Ljubljana Marshes Wheel in modern-day Slovenia and the cart tracks at Flintbeck in northern Germany. These sites speak of a time around 3000 to 3500 BCE, when Neolithic communities had begun to settle into a rhythm of mixed farming, growing grain, keeping animals, and establishing permanent dwellings. They were societies rooted in cycles, the turning of the seasons, the rounding of fields, the slow passage of generations. Here, the wheel was not a novelty, but a solution, a practical answer to the question of how to move what one could not carry. Carts, two-wheeled and four-wheeled alike, began to appear in connection with field work, construction, and the growing importance of local exchange. Often they were drawn by oxen, those patient, broad-shouldered animals whose slow gait matched the tempo of rural life. The wheels used were typically solid, made from single or composite pieces of timber. The design was straightforward, durable, and repairable with simple tools. Roads, such as they were, tended to be tracks across grass or through forest clearings, barely worn paths that broadened with use. In wetter regions, logs were sometimes laid down to form corduroy roads, or causeways of brush and branches were used to stabilize the ground. The carts themselves were rudimentary, flat platforms with low side rails, little more than a frame balanced atop two wheels and an axle. They carried stones for building, bundles of firewood, sacks of barley, or pots of milk from outlying farms. Their use reflected a slow, practical life, one where movement was purposeful and often communal. Over time, as metallurgy advanced, iron began to find its way into wheel construction. Metal rims were introduced to strengthen the wooden edge, especially in areas where carts were used heavily. Iron pins and brackets allowed for more precise fitting, reducing wear on the axle and improving stability. These additions did not change the fundamental form, but they helped wheels last longer, carry more, and travel further. In the Bronze Age, the wheel took on new meaning. With the development of chariots, light, two-wheeled vehicles with spoked wheels, mobility entered a new phase. These were not everyday carts, but rather specialized tools, used in ceremony, warfare, and display. They required skill to build and to drive. Their speed and agility made them a symbol of power and prestige. In Europe, the chariot found a home among warrior elites, particularly in cultures such as the Celts. Burial sites across the continent reveal chariots interred alongside their owners, often with fine harness fittings, weapons, and decorative elements. The wheel, once a servant of the field, had become a marker of status. Yet for most, the humble cart remained the norm. In Roman times, wheeled transport would become more sophisticated still, benefiting from paved roads, standardized axle widths, and improved suspension. But even before that, in the quiet corners of Europe's Iron Age, the wheel continued its slow, steady work. It bore the burdens of daily life, food, fuel, tools, and textiles. It supported small economies, linking villages to one another and to the wider world. It enabled construction, allowing stones to be hauled, timber to be gathered, earth to be moved, and it did so without ceremony. No one celebrated the turning of the wheel, it simply turned. We must imagine the landscape dotted with these carts, moving slowly along hedgerow paths, waiting in fields, creaking over wooden bridges, sheltering beneath lean-tos during sudden storms. They were part of the background, ever present, often unnoticed, but their absence would have been immediately felt. They helped stitch together the fabric of rural life, long before writing, before coinage, before kings. And though their wheels turned slowly, they helped set the rhythm of ancient Europe, circular, seasonal, steady. As the centuries turned, so too did the wheel, slowly, incrementally, and always in quiet dialogue with the needs of the people who used it. From its earliest days as a solid wooden disc, the wheel underwent a series of thoughtful refinements, each one modest on its own, yet together forming a lineage of gentle ingenuity. The improvements were not pursued for novelty, but for necessity, for smoother rides, for longer journeys, for loads that grew steadily heavier as societies became more complex. One of the most significant of these changes was the move from solid to spoked wheels. The solid wheel, though strong and dependable, was heavy. It added weight to the cart itself, reduced speed, and placed greater strain on both the axle and the animal drawing the load. In regions where speed or agility became more important, on battlefields, in trade, or in ceremonial processions, the limitations of the solid wheel became more apparent. The spoked wheel was a solution of elegance and lightness. By removing the heavy center and replacing it with evenly spaced supports, wheelwrights were able to maintain structural integrity while reducing weight dramatically. This change allowed carts and chariots to move more quickly, to respond more flexibly to changes in terrain, and to be drawn with less effort. The earliest spoked wheels are believed to have appeared around 2000 BCE, possibly in the steppes north of the Black Sea. Their construction required a different kind of skill, precise joinery, an understanding of tension and balance, and a feel for which woods would bend without breaking. The hub, into which the spokes were fitted, became a focal point of the wheel's structure. It had to be strong enough to anchor the axle, and yet shaped to allow the wheel to rotate smoothly around it. Axles, too, saw refinement. In early designs, the axle often turned with the wheel. But over time, craftsmen learned to fix the axle to the cart's undercarriage and allow the wheel to spin freely around it. This change reduced friction and wear, and made turning more efficient. Bearings, primitive by modern standards, were introduced, sometimes in the form of greased leather sleeves or wooden collars, which allowed smoother motion and less heat from friction. The rim of the wheel also changed. In solid wheels, the edge could wear down quickly, especially on rough paths or rocky ground. To counter this, wheelwrights began to fit iron or bronze bands around the outer rim. These metal tires, as they came to be called, extended the life of the wheel considerably. They were heated in a fire, then fitted tightly onto the wooden rim while still hot. As the metal cooled, it shrank, binding itself firmly to the wheel. The result was a tougher, more durable structure, one that could better endure the rigors of road and time. Suspension, while still rudimentary, also began to appear in certain designs. Some carts incorporated flexible components, bent wooden beams or leather straps that absorbed shocks and reduced the jarring impact of rough terrain. While not widespread in early periods, these features would become more common in Roman times and beyond, as comfort and the protection of delicate goods became more valued. The shape of carts evolved as well. What began as simple flat platforms grew into more specialized forms. Open carts for hay or timber, box carts for grain and pottery, covered wagons for long-distance travel. Wheels were matched to their function, broader and thicker for heavy loads, lighter and narrower for speed. Even roads, over time, began to adapt to the wheel. In places where traffic was frequent, tracks wore down into the earth, forming grooves that helped guide the wheels. In more advanced societies, such as the Roman Empire, roads were built with intention, graded, paved, cambered to drain water. Their design took into account the wheel's needs: firm surfaces, gentle inclines, regular widths. The wheel and the road began to shape one another. All these improvements did not arrive at once, nor did they spread evenly. In some regions, carts remained simple for millennia. In others, innovation came quickly, spurred by war, trade, or craftsmanship. But the overall trajectory was one of refinement, not revolution. The wheel was not reinvented. It was reimagined, slowly, again and again. Through it all, the essence remained: a round frame, turning around a central point, carrying a load from one place to another, whether fashioned from planks or spokes, bound with hide or ringed with iron, pulled by ox or horse. It remained recognizably a wheel, and each refinement brought with it not only practical benefit, but a subtle broadening of possibility. A cart that moved more smoothly could travel further. A lighter wheel could carry more cargo. A stronger rim could resist the wear of stony ground. These changes rippled outward, affecting how cities were built, how armies moved, how goods were exchanged, how lives were lived. The wheel, once a circle found in nature, had become a thing of precision and craft, and still it turned, quietly, persistently, carrying the world forward. As communities settled deeper into the rhythms of the land, agriculture became not just a means of survival, but the central pulse of daily life. Fields were cleared, crops were planted, and harvests were gathered with regularity and care. Over time, the wheel, already a quiet companion in transport and trade, began to find a deeper and more integrated role in these farming routines. It did not bring dramatic change all at once, but it helped to ease the labour, to extend reach, and to shape the very structure of work. Perhaps the most immediate contribution was in the hauling of loads. Harvest time, with its heavy sheaves of grain and full baskets of vegetables, demanded transport. Carts, drawn by oxen or horses, allowed farmers to gather more in a single journey. Instead of walking back and forth between field and storehouse, one could load a cart, wheel it home, and return again. In communities with shared carts, the efficiency increased still further as neighbours took turns or travelled in loose convoy, assisting one another as needed. Wheels also helped in the early stages of cultivation. While the plough itself did not depend on wheels, many ploughs were transported on carts to the fields, particularly in larger farming operations. Later developments would see wheeled frames used to carry seed drills or harvesting tools. especially as farming became more structured and predictable. The wheel, always modest, adapted to each new task without demanding attention. Even in the quieter seasons, carts played a role. Dung from animal pens was loaded and wheeled out to fields as fertilizer. Stones cleared from planting beds were heaped and carried away. Tools, too heavy or awkward to move by hand, were stacked on simple wagons and drawn into place. The wheel was not flashy, but it was consistent. It bore the repetitive burdens of the farming year without complaint. In wetter regions, wheels were adapted to cope with mud and water. Broader rims were developed to reduce sinking. Sometimes planks or mats were laid down to create stable paths across soft ground. The wheel responded to these changes patiently, altered not in essence, but in detail. In grain-growing areas, the wheel found another use entirely, the grinding of the crop itself. While the earliest mills were hand-powered, small querns turned by muscle, the principle of rotary motion soon extended to larger mechanisms. Horizontal millstones, mounted on a spindle, were turned by a wheel, first by hand, then by animal power. Eventually, these grinding wheels would be linked to water wheels and windmills, enabling a shift from personal labor to mechanical motion. The water wheel itself was another expression of the wheel's quiet power. By catching the flow of a stream and turning it into rotary motion, it allowed for grain to be milled continuously, with far less effort. In these wheels, set upright beside rivers and streams, one could see a blending of nature and tool, a soft alliance between water's gentle force and the wheel's obedient turning. In barns and granaries, small wheels and pulleys appeared, raising sacks of grain to lofts, lowering tools into cellars. Ropes wound around wooden spindles, turned by hand or foot, making lifting easier, more controlled. These were minor applications, perhaps, but they speak to the wheel's ubiquity, how it quietly found its place wherever motion was needed. Wheeled barrows, though often overlooked, were another agricultural aid. Single-wheeled or two-wheeled carts, small enough for one person to push, they allowed for more nimble movement through narrow rows and garden plots. Whether for carrying compost, or gathering herbs, or ferrying seedlings, they offered just enough support to lighten the load without complicating the task. The wheel, in all of these roles, became part of the landscape. It left tracks in the dirt, impressions in the mud, ruts that would guide future movement. Its sound, soft creaks, rhythmic clunks, became part of the background of rural life. But perhaps more subtly, the wheel also shaped how people thought about work and time. Tasks that once required a full day could be completed in half. The movement of goods became more regular, more predictable. Seasons were planned with greater certainty as the effort required for transport lessened. In this way, the wheel not only lightened the body, it softened the weight of time itself. The relationship between the farmer and the wheel was never dramatic. There were no festivals in its honor, no poems to celebrate its form, but its influence was steady and kind. It allowed people to grow more, store more, carry more. It allowed them to stay longer in one place, to build families, to think beyond the next harvest. And all the while, the wheel turned, across dry fields and muddy tracks, up farm lanes and into barns, under sun and cloud, through frost and thaw. It did not speak, but it was always listening, to the needs of the land, to the rhythm of the work, to the quiet hopes of those who guided it. Over time, the wheel became more than a tool. It began to turn not only upon the roads of the world, but also within the imagination of the people who used it. What had once been purely practical, a round object made to carry burdens, gradually took on symbolic meaning, woven gently into belief systems, philosophies, and rituals. The wheel, always in motion, came to represent much more than movement. It became a way to think about life itself. In many early cultures, the shape of the wheel echoed patterns already present in nature. The sun traced an arc across the sky. The moon waxed and waned in its monthly cycle. Seasons returned again and again. The wheel, in its endless turning, seemed to capture this rhythm, the steady return, the quiet repetition, the assurance that what passes will come again. Perhaps this is why so many early spiritual traditions adopted the wheel as a symbol of cosmic or divine order. In the Indian subcontinent, the chakra, a Sanskrit word meaning wheel, came to represent the cyclical nature of time and existence. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it appears as the Dharma chakra, or wheel of Dharma, a sacred image depicting the path of ethical and spiritual practice. The 8 spokes of this wheel often represent noble principles, offering a sense of orientation in a world that is always turning. In Europe too, the wheel found its way into early mythology. The Celts, whose societies were often mobile and close to the land, revered the wheel as a solar symbol. In some depictions, it was shown with rays or spokes echoing the sun's radiance. Wheels were buried with the dead or carved into stones, not merely as adornment, but as quiet reminders of a greater order, a movement beyond this life. Even in the realm of ritual, wheels were present. In certain spring festivals, great wooden wheels were set ablaze and rolled down hillsides, symbols of renewal, of the sun's return, of time's ever-turning nature. These events were not everyday occurrences, but carefully timed celebrations, acknowledging, perhaps unconsciously, the deep truth that underpins all movement, that to turn is to live. In ancient China, the wheel held both practical and philosophical weight. As part of cart and chariot, it represented power and refinement. But as a concept, it appeared in early texts to describe social and cosmic harmony. The center of the wheel, still and unchanging, became a metaphor for balance and calm within motion, an idea echoed centuries later in the teachings of Taoist and Confucian philosophers. In administrative life, the wheel sometimes marked authority. In Mesopotamia, seals and tablets occasionally included wheel-like motifs, signaling movement, trade, or the reach of governance. In time, the spoked wheel would appear on banners, coins, and architecture, not because it moved, but because it stood for something that did: society, progress, control. It's worth noting that the wheel's symbolism was not always gentle. In warfare, the spoked wheel of the chariot became a symbol of might, of tactical advantage. The turning wheel of a war machine, bearing warriors into battle, could be both feared and revered. In some myths, wheels were linked with storms, or with gods who ruled through force. And yet, despite these associations, the wheel's deeper symbolism often returned to steadiness, to the quiet comfort of cycles. In the medieval Christian world, the wheel appeared in allegory and art as the rota fortunae, the wheel of fortune. It showed human fate as something turning, now up, now down, suggesting both the inevitability of change and the need for humility. Life, like the wheel, was always in motion. In monasteries, circular layouts of cloisters and rose windows drew subtly from the wheel's form. Round towers and circular walkways reminded monks and pilgrims of the eternal. Time, it was thought, did not progress in a line, but returned in loops and spirals, again and again. In folk customs across Europe, wheels played a quieter role. Some were hung above doors as charms, others buried beneath threshing floors. The wheel was a thing of familiarity, and in that familiarity lay a kind of reverence. Not exalted, not worshipped, but respected. It entered language as well. Phrases like the wheel of time, the wheel of fate, and the wheels of progress all hint at a deeper recognition that what turns does not simply move, but transforms. That rotation is not just motion, but meaning. In all these uses, religious, philosophical, cultural, the wheel retained its simplicity. It did not boast, it did not shine, it turned. And in turning, it invited reflection on seasons, on effort, on return, on the stillness at the center and the movement all around. The first wheel, shaped in silence, has long since disappeared, its wood decayed, its axle splintered, its path forgotten. Yet the idea it embodied, that simple rotation, that unassuming circle, echoes gently through time, present in ways both obvious and hidden. The wheel did not vanish into history. It continued to turn, sometimes noisily on the road, sometimes quietly in the mind, sometimes imperceptibly beneath the surface of modern life. In the centuries that followed its earliest appearances, the wheel remained a constant companion. The cart, the wagon, the chariot, all evolved, adapted and spread, woven into the fabric of civilizations, both great and humble. The Roman Empire built its vast network of roads with wheels in mind, grooved paving stones and measured distances, all meant to ease the rumbling passage of wagons bearing grain, bricks, wine, and people. In medieval Europe, the wheel continued to serve in the same gentle fashion, rolling beneath plough carts and harvest wagons, helping blacksmiths turn grinding stones, raising water in wooden buckets from wells. It had become so ordinary that it was rarely remarked upon. The wheel was not celebrated in poems or chronicles. It simply turned, bearing burdens, smoothing labour, enduring quietly. As the world changed, the wheel remained. The spinning wheel transformed how thread was made, allowing one to twist fibres more evenly and quickly. Water wheels, driven by streams and rivers, powered early mills, grinding grain and shaping timber. Later, the great wheels of the Industrial Revolution, flywheels, gear wheels, and locomotive wheels took their place, still relying on the same principle of rotation, refined now in metal and steam. Even as the world grew more complex, more hurried, more ambitious, the wheel retained its quiet dignity. The bicycle wheel, slender and spoked, offered independence and mobility to millions. The car wheel, shod now in rubber, inflated with air, carried people into the 20th century. The wheel of the airplane, tucked away beneath wings, touched down on runways across a shrinking world. And in every instance, the essence remained, a circle, turning steadily around a center, reducing friction, converting effort into motion. Each innovation was a variation on this simple theme. Even today, in a world lit by screens and ruled by silicon, the wheel still turns. Beneath the delivery lorry, the suitcase, the hospital gurney, the office chair, it is part of the unnoticed background of our lives. In many ways, the wheel's story is not one of invention but of endurance. It did not demand recognition. It offered utility. And in doing so, it became indispensable. The first person who watched a stone roll downhill or dragged a bundle across a log could not have imagined the long thread of influence they were beginning. But in that small, slow observation, a revolution began. Today, the wheel remains a symbol of motion, of time, of cycles. It turns in our language, in our machines, in our ideas. It can be found in the orbit of planets, in the gears of clocks, in the quiet motion of prayer wheels and spinning tops. It reminds us that progress does not always rush. Sometimes it rolls, slowly, steadily, with a kind of quiet grace. Perhaps that is why the wheel endures so well. It suits our rhythms. It mimics our days, the way they begin, turn, return. It moves forward not by leaps, but by revolutions, each one echoing the last. And so the first wheel, long gone, continues to be present, not in wood or axle, but in every act of gentle motion that follows its pattern. As we end our slow journey through its story, we can pause to reflect, not to marvel at the wheel's cleverness or to romanticize its form, but simply to recognize its place. In our past, yes, but also in our present, quiet, humble, always turning, like time itself.